Hi, so this is the second time I filmed this and I'm hoping this time it works out. I had a question about whether engrams could be used as watercolor because they're so vibrant and they basically don't contain any white pigments. Before I answer that question, because I don't use gouache a lot at all, and the only gouache I really have is the engram. The other type of gouache I have is the Acryla Gouache by Holbein, but that's not like regular gouache. Gouache usually reactivates with water even after it dries, whereas Acryla Gouache is something like a mix between acrylics and gouache, and they don't actually reactivate by the time they are completely dry. So they're not the same. So basically the question was if they could be used as watercolors, and before I could answer the question, I thought I would actually look at comparisons between the two because, like I said, I don't use gouache. I'm sorry about the shaking. I'm using my phone to record this and it's not very stable. So I'm going to be comparing my Hansa Yellow, my Quinacridone Rose, my Phthalocyanine Blue, and my Burnt Sienna. I have all those colors in both watercolor, which are in the pans here, and in my tubes. Now, first big difference. I made the mistake at some point. I mixed in my blue ultramarine gouache with my regular watercolors, and when I put it in the pan I realized, oh no, it's gouache, not watercolor. And this is what happened after the pan dried out. Basically you can see it cracked, it fell out, you can see how it has dried super dry, and it actually, you have to be careful because it's gonna make a mess. So if you ever decide to travel with your gouache, you cannot put them in pans without risking it just making a mess. If you can imagine a dozen of these in a palette rattling around, you're gonna have more pigment all over your palette as opposed to in your pans. This is what the ultramarine blue looks like in watercolor. It takes time before it dries, and it never dries completely. I haven't used this one in probably a few weeks, and you can see how it glistens still, and when you touch it, it's still a little soft to the touch. It's not sticky in the sense that it doesn't leave any residue, but it is, you can feel it. There's a little bit of give. Now, depending on the watercolors, like you see Burnt Sienna, it actually dries a lot better. I used this one a couple of days ago, and no, I think I even used it yesterday, and it is pretty dry, but it's not cracking. And you can see with the other ones, same. Whereas I'm pretty sure all of these would be like my ultramarine, an absolute disaster in a pan. So if what you want to do with your watercolor is be able to travel with it, forget about using gouache to replace it. The other big difference is the flow. Now, yes, they're pretty vibrant. However, as you can see, these are layered, so it's glazed over. They're pretty much okay. You can see how the gouache actually layers on top of itself pretty well. Same thing with the watercolors, of course. But the big, huge difference here is the flow. If you can see, I put a wash of water here and just put a small wash of color at the top, and it flowed all the way down. I did the same thing with my gouache, and I put water all over and then put a small string of color here, and it barely moved, it barely reaches the line. Same with the Quinacridone Rose. Wash here, it went all the way, and this one really exploded. The gouache barely moved. Phthalocyanine Blue didn't move much, but it did flow. Whereas, as you can see, it stayed put in the gouache. Now, when it comes to Burnt Sienna, it actually is somewhat similar when it comes to flow. It barely reaches over the line, and same thing for this here. The big difference for the burnt sienna is actually the translucency and vibrancy of the color. I don't know if you can tell, I might need to do a scan and put it on, but the color is a lot more translucent here and luminous. It has almost an orange quality to it, whereas here it's a lot more mattified and a lot more brown. Now, I did an example here of how gouache flows as opposed to how watercolor flows. Basically, I put a wash of blue, a wash of Quin Rose, and a wash of Hansa Yellow. And this is watercolor, and you can see how it almost completely erases all the white. Whereas I put a wash of blue, Quin Rose, and yellow, and it barely moved away from where I put the color. You can see here it barely moved. It was here in the middle and it barely moved. Here at the top and it barely moved all the way here. It was here and it looks like it didn't move at all except at the very beginning here. And you can see how I layered the colors on top of each other. You can ignore the orange here. I had some transparent pure orange left on my plate, and I didn't want to waste it, so I started putting it here. But you can see the effects you can have with watercolor, which as if you layer and you do wet on wet with wash, it's really not going to give you the same effect. It's going to be a lot more graphic. So you're going to do a lot of graphic painting, where you don't want necessarily for your color to burst and flow, then you have a lot more control with gouache. Now, because the difference in flow is extreme, I thought I would show it live. Now, this is the first time I did it, and I did it wet on wet, so this is the second time I'm actually doing this. I'm gonna turn it around. Now, in these, I used Fabriano studio paper. It's student grade paper, 140 pound, 25% cotton, cold press. I didn't want to use my good paper for these swatches, but I thought I would give you swatches on some Arches paper, 100% cotton, and 140 pound, 300 DSM, and I would show you how the colors flow and how different it is. First, I'm gonna wet both of these. The big difference is in the wet on wet application. And this is where I would say, if what you want from watercolor is the wet on wet aspect, the flow, well, you are never going to achieve any of that with gouache, no matter how translucent and vibrant the colors are, because the engrams are pretty translucent. Well, that sinks in a little. You can tell with the watercolor and with the gouache, they're translucent enough that the lines show. This is after 4 applications of layering the color, and it still shows. Of course, I watered down the color enough to be able to use it almost as watercolor, but still you can see the line through all 4 of these. Even burnt sienna, which is probably the most opaque of the colors here, you can clearly see the line. Okay, it's getting a little messy. Okay, let it absorb a little bit more. It's getting dirty because I have watercolor on the bottom one there. Okay, first the watercolor, because it's easy to have here, whereas it's difficult to do this with gouache. I need to put it fresh on my plate. So I'm gonna do my phthalo blue on top. This is the one that travels the least. So I'm gonna put that top. I'll do 2 of these. And you can see how far it goes, or doesn't go. Now I'm gonna do some Quin Rose, middle. And as you can see, this one just explodes. And I put it again. And I'm not moving the paper, right? I'm leaving it as far as I can get it. Because I just want to see the flow as it is without me pushing it around on the paper. And now for the yellow. Well, this one doesn't seem to move much right now, but it might be because my paper did dry up a bit by the end. I'm just gonna put a little bit more color on the very edge. And if it flows, it flows. Now, let's do it with the gouache. And like I said, with gouache, I want to use it fresher out of the tube as opposed to dry from the plate, just to give it a little bit of oomph for it to travel. Oh, this is what I dislike working with gouache, because I have to use it fresh out of the tube for it to work well. I feel like I waste a lot of color. Now I'm gonna have to try and find a way to use this color wherein I don't feel like doing gouache right now. I want to do some more watercolor, but I'm gonna have to come up with something. Alright, so like the first time, I'm just gonna wet this a little bit more, because at this point this one would have dried up enough compared to the first swatches I did. Okay, so I'm gonna put some blue on top. Then some Quin Rose in the middle. And remember, I had some phthalo in there. But you can see it barely travels. And now some hands of yellow. At the very bottom. And I'll put it in again. And that's it. You can see the color really didn't travel, and I think the bottom part here had already dried, because I can see clearly where I put my color and it didn't travel at all, and the bottom part here was already a little bit dry, and still you can see how the yellow just expanded. To answer your question, can you use your M-gram gouache as watercolor? Well, it depends on how you use watercolor. If you don't use it when on wet, and you don't mind it being a little bit matte, you probably could. The M-gram colors are, like I said, very vibrant, they can layer well, and they are translucent. However, they are more matte than the watercolors, and they do not flow. I hope this answers any questions you may have. If you have any other questions, I can try and answer them, but like I said, gouache is not my medium. I only have a few colors and I don't use them that often. If you want to see really good videos that compare watercolor application with gouache application, Hejra Meeks, I hope I'm saying the name right, on YouTube. Hejra Meeks has a series of videos comparing gouache to watercolor, the application, and she's a great artist, really fun to watch, and you learn a lot. I know I did. So I'll put the link down in the comments section. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching. Ciao! Oh, geez. Ciao! That sounded awful. Ciao! 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 Dying cat. Dying cat.